ask the question, so do you actually physically think that this is an electronic voice phenomenon that you believe is actually a ghost? And when they say yes, come back and logically explain it. Well, from my standpoint working in audio engineering, I can tell you that if you adjust the individual levels, it can sound exactly like this. Do you think something like that could have happened in your case?
I like that. You know, it sounds like, Chris, you'd be the perfect cross-examiner in a courtroom.
Oh, yeah, doesn't it?
Yeah, the trick is to get them to talk without making them mad, and they dig their own hole that way.
Yep. And a lot of times, it's a professionalist. I mean, I guess it's the politics in me. I don't like to push buttons like most people do, but I do like to state the facts as the way the facts are. All of the media that I put out, all of the articles I've written, even my Facebook group that every now and then I put in there, I put the reality of the paranormal and the reality of the science and the reality of what we're looking at in it. Most people don't take the time to do the research. They jump in. They think it's all fun and games with night vision cameras and thrills and so forth, and then they put together a show. But that's really not what this is about. If you're really into the study, if you're really in-depthly into it, you understand the differences. And I sat up in front of a class for media that was curious about the paranormal, and they asked a lot of questions. One of the things that I told them, and I covered this on a show quite recently, is night vision cameras are for us. They're not for real paranormal study. You're out there filming because you want to catch yourself. If you really think you're going to catch a ghost on that, you're not. It's a misconception. Cameras were brought in so that we can film ourselves. In the old study, yes, we used cameras, but we used them for different purposes. If you actually go back far enough and you look at some of the research projects, and some of this has leaked out on the internet, some of it's been on TV shows from time to time in brief pieces, you'll notice a lot of times you're seeing people walk in front of the cameras, you're seeing the cameras run for prolonged periods in time, you're seeing the back of people's arms while they're talking to people, you're not getting solid audio a lot of times. That's all because it was there to collect evidence, and you knew 99% of the time when you set up cameras in every room, you probably weren't going to get anything. But you still had to have that data so you could put the numbers together. And if you got something that occurred more than once, maybe you had something that was going to happen. It was all a part of the process. That changed when the paranormal became ghost hunting and we had our media run, and the science fell. You had a downfall in the paranormal in the late 70s to early 80s, and you had an uprising in the late 90s to early 2000s to a whole new game. And people assume that's the game, so they go out and do it. And don't get me wrong, I'm not going to diss any of that when people do it. Hey, if you want to create a show and you want to go out and ghost hunt, good for you. That's great. But don't assume that that's the way it should be, because that's not the real paranormal study. It's not really how it works. It's not really how people go about it. Real paranormal study takes grants. It takes funding. It takes $15,000 to $27,000 worth of equipment. It takes time. You may never get your answers. You may never get your funding again. Somebody may look at you when you've got your funding for 2 years at the end of that, if you didn't get any results, if you didn't get any answers, if you didn't find something that they can use, and say, sorry, not going to give you any money anymore. Now you got to go out and search for the next 3 years to try to continue your project.
Oh, yeah.
That's just like science.
That's what I can't understand with some of these people that, like one ghost hunting group, they go out and spend an hour at somebody's house to try to prove that there is ghost and the house is haunted. You can't do it in an hour. You can't do it in a day. You can't do it in a week. I mean, that is something you'd have to repeatedly actually go back at all different times and have your equipment in there. And you're not going to go do it with a $100 camera and a $100 audio recorder. It's just not going to work.
Nope. It takes years and years and years. And sometimes you still may not have those answers. Or you may run out of funding, or there's thousands of things that could happen during that process. This is why a lot of university projects end after a certain point. Either you find out answers that make you realize you're on the wrong track in the first place, or you just simply don't have the right funding for it. You run out of time, you run out of money, and you can't do it anymore.
Yeah.
But
Chris, I got a little story about the Professor Grover Krantz, who was really into the Bigfoot, and he was actually a full-time professor. at Washington State University, where I just happened to go get a broadcasting degree at the time when I was a kid. And you're right, this guy actually spent years and years in the field and had a full-time professorship at the same time to be able to develop the evidence that he had so that he wouldn't be just dismissed or debunked. It took him a long time to kind of get this whole idea of cryptozoology, considered credible in the scientific field. I think he was a pioneer in that regard.
Well, yeah, and there are a few pioneers when you're talking about ghost hunting, but I spoke on a radio show just yesterday, actually, the day before yesterday on this, and she asked me, what do you think a ghost is and what do you think we should look for? And I told her very honestly, I had a professor quite recently that we were speaking on this, and a lot of times people talk about a ghost in the word non-physical. But when you look at science, what does the term non-physical mean? Non-physical is a name for something that we need in order for the math to add up from point A to point B. So what is non-physical? Space is non-physical. You can't physically see the space, but you have to have a definition for the space so that the math adds up. Time is non-physical. We can see the effects of time, but we don't see time itself. But we needed a name in order to add up point A to point B. Ghost is the same way. You say a ghost is non-physical. Non-physical means it has no shape, it has no form, it does not physically exist, and you need a name in order to add up the math between point A and point B. That way you got something to define and look for. So when people say a ghost can manifest, when people say a ghost has physical presence, well, then it's not non-physical anymore. Non-physical, a ghost is a word, it's a term. So what should we be looking for? Well, we have to define what that is. We have to look further into that. We have to understand that, and we have to understand the parameters that don't correspond with that. Right now, we're not at a point to doing that. People just run around with night vision cameras, and they look at the wrong evidence, or they run around with audio and EVP, and they get the wrong evidence, or they run around with EMF meters, which don't work the way people think they work. Or they run around with nickel and dime store things that they're spending $500 for that you can create in your basement for about $5.50.
Oh, hey, one thing, Chris, I have an extensive background in photography. I mean, probably equal to what my broadcasting was. I was one of the first people to get a digital camera from Nikon, and it was like a 0.5 megapixel SLR camera to test out years ago. And I know digital imaging. I know Photoshop. I know how, also I went to schooling to repair digital cameras. So I know what the sensors can do and can't do. What really frustrates me, there isn't a day somebody wants to be a guest on my show. It sends me over pictures and say, I have these orbs out of my front, out of my kitchen window or off my porch. I take these pictures, and every night these colored orbs are appearing. They don't understand how a lens works, how an aperture works, how that, light down the street from the street light or their porch light could reflect back in that lens and hit that aperture blades and multiply numerous times in that lens. And that's their orbs, and they don't realize that. And I mean, I don't want to deflate the people and say, hey, you need to. But, I look at some of these people that posted on Facebook, and their streaks of orbs are nothing more than them hand-holding a camera, a digital camera, and the imager, like what I just said.
Uh-huh. Yeah, well, and the same thing applies when I'm talking to people, and it goes over a lot of people's heads when I tell you what should we be looking for in a ghost. Well, you got to go beyond that to an explanation. There are a lot of different things in science, and when you get into the theoretical, that can define exactly what's going on. If you're in a room and something flies across a room from point A to point B, okay, something's going on. I can't explain why the picture frame flew off the wall and flew across the room. That's great. That's a personal experience. You should be looking for why that is, and there are other things beyond explaining that was my grandfather or that was Sarah and she died in this room. How do you know it was Sarah and she died in this room? You really don't. You don't know that that's the case. Could it be something else? Could it be a physical energy brought in by the mind? The answer is sure, theoretically. Could it be quantum physics? Could we actually be dealing with something that's interfering with something else that caused that to happen? Sure. It could be a lot of those different things that explain what we're seeing, what's going on. But people stop and they just say, I got an audio device here. And being from an audio background, spirit boxes and everything except for a digital recorder, and even digital recorders and EVP can be logically explained to some point when you deal with how audio breaks down.
Well, spirit boxes are really easy to explain.
Oh, they are. In fact, you can do the same thing with a spirit box on an old-fashioned radio and 2 speakers.
Oh, yeah.
Which most people don't understand. You could do the same thing on your television. I've presented that, again, in universities, and people are amazed with it. You know, if you do it properly, randomly changing your television forward and backward, forward and backward, forward and backward, you can carry on a conversation with the TV.
Oh, yeah. Well, you know, that's how I feel. Now I'm going to get some hate mail on this one, but again, with my, I have an extensive electronic background. And, when you go into phase lock circuitry, you go into how the radios are worked, all they're doing is getting the radios to scan the frequencies really fast. So they're scanning up and down every which way. So you can ask it a question like, do you smoke cigarettes? And you're going to get yes, a good chance. You're going to hear yes, because it's going to be scanning all the radio frequencies up and down.
Absolutely, and you're going to get the same name repetitively. You're going to get the same questions answered repetitively. You can physically carry on a limited conversation by scanning things forward and backward. I mean, it's common understanding if you've ever worked in audio engineering, if you've ever repaired electronics. I grew up in a background where my dad was an electronics engineer. He repaired stereos for years. He repaired televisions for years. And when he first saw spirit boxes pop up, he laughed his butt off. He was like, come on, man. So, I mean, it's very easy to debunk those things. EVP is a little bit harder, especially if you put it in a Faraday cage and you're not supposed to get those signals come in. But if you actually look into the background of engineering and how audio travels and the fact that physically, before it breaks down totally, it can travel billions of miles and you could still pick up 1 word or 2 words or 3 words, are we really picking up something that hasn't been said before in the past? The answer is we don't know.
Yeah, that's so true.
You could be picking up random signal. This conversation that we're having, my voice is going to travel for years. Now, you're not going to be able to pick it up regularly, but you can still pick it up if you know what you're looking for. You can pick up the tone. You can pick up the adverb. Every sound travels, and every sound breaks down differently and tears apart differently how it travels. So what are we really listening to? Are we really talking to somebody that responded, or are we picking up something that's just another random audio signal or word that is carried on and broken down to the point to where we're only getting one segment of it now?
Well, I will say this, guys. Back about 8 months ago, I took my little digital recorder. I went to a cemetery. It goes back to like 1870 in my area. And, I didn't hear any noises, but I had it on, and I did what, I was told I should do. I got home, I started playing back, and I heard a little kid talking ever so often, or saying little things. And I'm going, okay, well, I was in the cemetery, there's no houses by. Well, at least I thought there was no houses. In the back part of the cemetery, there was maybe 40 feet of fir trees, and behind the fir trees, there was a house. So, I went the next day to try to debunk the thing, and that's when I discovered, hey, there's a house there. And indeed, they had little kids playing in the backyard because they were playing when I went back there. Now, a lot of people would have went home, heard that noise. There's their, spirit. So people really need to, examine what they do a little bit more. I mean, sounds can carry. I mean, especially at night, if you're out in the cemetery, you got your recorder going and you're looking for, spirit sounds and stuff like that. It could be being picked up from a quarter mile away from somebody's, screaming at their wife or something. And
generally it is. Now, I will say on the flip side, working with EVP, I have ran into situations where I can't explain it. I was at Myrtle's